Kyra, I'm so excited to be asking you about your book. This is going to be a lot of fun. Um, your writing seems to have really taken off after a long period of relative quiet. Do you want to talk about your rebirth as a writer?
Oh, I am yeah, I could talk about this for a long time. It feels so surreal to be back into this sphere. Writing was always my passion as a child and something that I dreamed of doing forever, far longer than art. But due to like some trauma and health issues and stuff, about 8, 9 years ago, I stopped being able to write. It was like that door in my brain closed. It was really hard for me to even string like sentences together. And I just lost so much of my access to that. And art was what caught me, was a way that I could like um, express all the things that were still inside me that I couldn't find words for anymore. And then over the last couple of years through therapy and healing and all of that stuff, it just felt like that door. I started like I don't know, getting past notes under the crack of the door and everything in my, in this part of me. And once it finally opened, it was just like, hi, we've been waiting this whole time. And words I've oh my gosh, it's been wonderful to come back to it. And it's surreal for sure.
That's so encouraging. I think a lot of people are going to feel encouraged to see that healing manifest in creativity. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned being a visual artist as well as a writer. Are there things that you learned during your period in which you were primarily focused on visual art that you feel like transfer into your work as a writer?
Oh, yeah, so much. I'm giving a session on this this fall. And so I don't want to go into it too much, but I think one of the ways when we first craft our creativity and we see how it likes to flow through us when we create like a creative practice, I think the habits and the mentality and the neurons pathways that form when we do that transfer into whatever other creative medium we're working in and tweak or change. But I see that I approach writing scenes and overall books like creating the composition of a painting. Like I look at it and go like, okay, well, if this is where I want to draw the reader's eye, what do I focus on and what do I kind of let be background? What do I blur out and what do I detail? Where do I put the highest contrast so that it draws you through the story and you pick up on themes? And when you're painting, you um, use opposite colors or you do things, but you don't ever do that in like one spot. You let those paint strokes show up in a couple different places and it feels cohesive. And so I think hiding phrases and hints throughout the book feels to me like those little paint strokes that reflect back to the core focus. So I do. They're so interconnected, I think, because I first like formed a solid creative practice around art that now when I approach writing, I see it from a lot of a similar angle.
Yeah. So this would have been a different book had you tried to write it before your gap.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't think it would have, I don't think it's possible. So much of how this book is constructed comes from that perspective of composition and stuff that I it wouldn't exist without art also.
that's really redemptive to see that a period of brokenness could result in a period of greater beauty and depth.
Mm,
I like
yes. Yeah.
So, okay, this book is set in Scotland, and
Yeah.
tell me about what inspires you about Scotland.
So when I went to Scotland last fall for the first time, and it was an anniversary trip with my husband, and I had actually just finished writing a different novel 3 days before we got on the plane to Scotland, and I had set my goal that that would be finished before I left because I knew there was a story waiting in Scotland for me. I had no idea what it was going to be, and I was like, kind of like maybe it's not. Like maybe that's just in my head. But this is a place I've dreamed of going my whole life. And it's my ancestors are from there originally, so there's a lot of ties. So or my husband's ancestors, and so there are ties back. We were going to go visit where his family had immigrated from. A whole bunch of pieces. This was
Right.
kind of this trip. Um, and then getting there and taking the train across the country towards Skye. Um, we have video of my husband trying to like film, well, actually filming me while I film out the window because I'm just crying. I'm just,
Oh.
I like filming and just like tears are just pouring down my cheeks. Um, because of a lot of that ancestral piece, my family moved from Scotland and settled in West Virginia, and the area near the area that I'm in now in the Appalachians. And so we're still here and realizing why they also, if you don't, um, the Appalachians and the mountains of the Scottish Highlands are the same mountain range. It was believed like before the Pangean split, they were all the same mountains. And when you see them, and if you know the Appalachians here, they are the same. You get it. You're like, oh, they're sisters. They used to be connected. And so taking the train through them and seeing so many familiarities like reflected to the land that I love and have known and called home forever to this homeland. Um, and yet also going, my favorite parts of here, that I like zoom in on, like, oh, this little fern and this moss. Oh my gosh, I love that. And going, now we're going to put it on a scale times 100 and go, you can look forever and you'll never see it all. One was so overwhelming. I was just immediately like, I want to be like a student of place now more than ever. I don't to just spend a week like here and then move a couple feet and then spend a week just studying this. I just, and it was all interconnected between that sense of belonging and place and recognizing why my ancestors would have settled here and said like, oh, it feels like home. But it just a piece of the home that they couldn't stay in. And I think that speaks, there was so much of those feelings and emotions percolating in me that when we got off the train, landed in the little fishing village on the edge of Scotland before we were going to spend the night and then take the ferry to Skye the next morning. I, spent the whole day just soaking all of that in and crying. And we got the best dinner of our lives, get a whiskey at the hotel and then settle in for bed. And I can't sleep. This is just like over and over. And I end up staying up till 2, like typing on my phone the first pages of this book. The whole story it was just this quippy, funny, lighthearted little thing. The next morning on the ferry, I read it to my husband, and he's like, it's a very different writing style. The narrator is different than I've written before. And I'm just like, I'm so excited about this. And yes, you're right. It's really different than what I've done in the past. But I just couldn't get it out of my head. And I say, I met Margie on that train. There was just this sense looking out those windows of something, this story weaving through the woods and waiting for somebody to tell it. And I couldn't drop it. Like it was after that, it just had burrowed so deep into my soul that it needed to come out.
I love it. I love it. You said two things that I'm interested in exploring a little bit more. One, you said something about being a student of place. What did that mean to you?
Mm. Oh, I love feeling like a student, like a scholar. There's only been a couple points in my educational background. I wrote a thesis and a couple things where it was like, I have so much I need to get out. I need to go find a giant whiteboard and just, sprawl everything out. You're sitting on the ground with your research all around you. It's just, I love that feeling of like finding something and digging into it and trying to understand and master all of it. And so that pawns up very like academia, dark academia, like candles and, Gandalf, like in the, going through the library and fellowship, like that feeling. But going, what if we felt that way about place? And sometimes that's about place among a community of people, and what makes you feel safe and connected and all of that. Sometimes it's by yourself in nature and going like, what are all the little pieces here that somehow add together to make this what it is? It's that fern, but it's also that light, and it's also that like the chemical composition of the dirt that makes it smell like this when it rains, and it's the dust particles that are going up through here, and maybe the mold also, and this and that, and how much had to come together to make this moment right here. But then you blink and it's another moment, and a million eternities came to make that one that, and then it happens again and again and again. And I can sit in front of a mountain range with clouds creating shadows on it, and I feel like I could sit there for an eternity because it will be different every time I blink and reopen my eyes. And that's that sense of like, I want to be Gandalf in the library to this one little patch of grass and that one mountain range. And I feel like I'd never master it enough somehow.
That sounds like something that we've lost a lot because of all the time we spend in technology and artificial lights and closed spaces just to get out and listen to kind of the instinctive realm.
Wonder.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing was you mentioned prepping for a book that you felt like was coming. I love that concept. So what was that like for you?
Oh my gosh. Well, it was mixed in with the emotions of finishing the other one. They were so right on the heels of each other. And the other one meant, saying goodbye to characters. It's a standalone, and it'll come up eventually, but it's a heart book for me. And it was the book that, like was the forerunner in, oh, I can do this, and my words are back, and here's what that is going to feel like. So it was saying goodbye to a bunch of little pieces of my heart, and closing that story, because I knew I didn't want to open the door for duology or anything else that needed to be closed. So saying goodbye to them, and that fear in me of what if that's the only story I have. And I think that for all artists and writers and musicians, that's this fear of like, oh, I wrote something I'm really proud of. I created something I love, and I'll never get to make it again. Like this is the peak. And after this, it's gone. There's this fear of work, of being stale, and of, already finishing it, and so it was battling a lot of those insecurities and grieving and saying goodbye. And yet this just, I don't know what it is with my brain, but stories and smell are strongly connected. The same feeling that you have when you sniff something. I'd say like I would just started smelling the story. Like there's just this sense of somebody's cooking, like somebody's in the kitchen making cookies, and you can smell it. It's like that, and you could just smell like, oh, there's a story coming, and it's gonna be okay to close this one and to set it down, and the writing process. I'll be back a million times to edit it and do everything else before it's done, but and it's not over for me. Like there's more, and like somebody's still cooking, and I don't know what flavors are going into it yet. I can just like start to get an idea. So there was a little bit of like, so a guest is going to come stay at your house, and you don't know who they are, and you don't know when they're coming. You're just clearing house and trying to get ready. That was that whole process of preparing to go to Scotland. Was like, oh, I need to make room for somebody, and I don't know who they are and what they need of me.
Sort of hospitality, really. I mean,
Yeah.
And when I'm hearing you talk, it sounds like faith, hope, and love in a really creative sort of way. Faith that there's going to be more, and hope, and love for your past characters, and welcome for your new ones. It's really, that's beautiful. Okay, so let's talk about this mist sprite concept. How did you develop this, and why is she named? What does she have the name that she does?
Yeah, she's named Margie, not Margaret. Not it's Margie, and sometimes we call her Marge. The narrator calls her Marge as a nickname. And now I've slowly just started training people in my lives that whenever they see like a mist on a mountain or something, they just say, hi, Marge. And it's so cute. I'll get like messages from followers and people that I don't know with a picture of mist on their mountain and hi, Marge. And I'm just slowly gonna, convince everybody to talk to clouds. I've loved fog and mist forever, but especially here, I'm in part of the Appalachians at the Blue Ridge Mountains, and so the mist hangs really low between the mountains and those valleys and settles in, and there's something that's always felt like a hug about that. And like a warm blanket that lifts every morning, and I cannot get enough of it. But when I was in Scotland on the train and the mist is constantly coming and going, you would go from like it's gray and raining to suddenly sunny and rainbows. We saw like 15 rainbows on that one train trip just because it's constantly moving. 1 second it's this and then it's just constantly changing. And so somebody had said once, and I do not remember who and where I'd heard this, but that in these countries in the north, the atmosphere is its own character.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck with me. And I had that in the back of my brain as I went to Scotland. And then seeing it like, oh, that is what's different. Like the mountains are the same. The ground feels the same, but the atmosphere is this different character. This mist is something else. And from the moment that I sat down to write that in the hotel bed on my phone, her name was Margie. And I went back and revisited that 1,000 times throughout development and editing. I was like, why? Why Margie? I thought I was going to create like some witty reason why. And it wasn't. It's just her name. And I don't know why. And she's very specific. She is a piece of mist that has indwelled one specific glen for eons, for eternity. So she is not the mist all over Scotland. She's not technically the mist here, even though we say hi to her. And so there was this idea of like, yeah, there's probably mist sprites in other areas, but the way that the mist settles into a glen and then the atmosphere, it's gonna evaporate and it's gonna rain back down on those. When you're in those glens and the mountains are high enough, it feels so insular. And each glen you pass through has its own nature and feeling, and some are really friendly and some are a little standoffish. There's something about the land, and I think that's true here too. I think that's true in a lot of different places. So getting to know like, oh, in this one glen there's this one atmosphere, and her name is Margie and I don't know why, and it's one of those like she's had the name forever apparently.
So sweet. So you said that you love research. You love the scholarly part of this. Tell me about the research that went into this project.
So when I started, I wrote the first 3 pages. I thought this is going to be, well, one, I love novellas. I love small books. I can go into that more later. But I'd had a goal, and my first book turned out way longer than I wanted it to be. And I was like, I would love to challenge myself to write a short novel. I think you have to do it. You have to weave a story so tightly. You have to pick your words very specifically. But then if you want it to have character and flavor and stuff, you have to build this like internal dictionary that's it's like putting all the ingredients into a pot and letting it simmer until it's small. That's the feeling. It's like, yeah, you could make a big soup or you could make a sauce if you are patient enough and you let it like really, really sit. I don't know why I'm making so many cooking references. It sounds like I cook a lot. I do not. So that was, I was like, okay, I want to see if I can challenge myself to make it a short story. It's just going to be this cute little story about the mist discovering humans and being like, whoa, those are weird. And then somehow falling in love with them. And then, I was like, I think I'll set it around the time that there was this mass immigration from Scotland to the Appalachians. And, they'd all be kind of tied into my history and whatever. And when you drive through the Highlands and there's big, big open spaces, you think like, oh, it's so wild and it's always been wild. And now the land has only been discovering people more recently. And then I came home and started doing my research. And I love when a story is based in enough truth that when you go, whoa, is that real? Did that really happen? You go look it up and you find out it did. Like, that's one of my favorite things. I love to have a lot of like historical grounding under stories. And I was just like, this story is going to be mostly just this cute little thing. I'll just have some historical grounding. But while I looked it up, why did a lot of people move to the Appalachians in this time? Why did all this stuff? It just uncovered this massive historical context, and also revealed that all those empty, barren places are not supposed to be. They all had people on them. Every time you cross through this big, empty, vast plain and think, wow, we still have wild places. It wasn't supposed to be wild. There were supposed to be communities and families and children there. And so I realized this story, if I wanted to tell her meeting humans, I'd have to go back 800 years. And so I start the book. Technically, the first chapter is like a little bit outside of time. It's pre 1100. And then the book, chapter two, starts in 1300. And so I then, my wall was a whiteboard timeline of the entire like Scottish history from 1200-ish to 1900. And I had to know everything that's happening. Now, the story is retold through the perspective of the land and its children. So these characters don't know everything that's happening. They don't know why things are happening, but I had to know it so I could weave it in so that as an adult reading the story, we read between the lines and we go, oh, something's up. And either you go flip to the back of the book where there's historical references and you can figure, you can read what was happening, or you go look it up yourself. Like, why was this reference? Why was that reference? Why was this such a motivating factor, etc. Mm-hmm. And it was really heavy. I was doing this research in October and November. And so reading about mass displacement events at the same time as current events, there was a lot of times where I went like, is this a story I can tell right now? And just a huge feeling of like, it is the only story. It is the only story I can tell right now. This is a story I can tell because it happened to my ancestors, but it's also all I can think about. And here's a way that I can tell this and it be true and mine, but also reflect a bigger thing that's happening, has always happened. Human displacement has always happened, and holding the tension of my ancestors, and the Scottish people who were displaced during the clearances. A lot of them came to America and displaced native indigenous people from here, and these dominoes fall, and this is something that has always had long arms. And so anyway, in reading and researching, you kind of get a sense that there was hard things going on. There's eyewitness accounts and there's all of this stuff, but to get what would the land have felt and what would have each individual have felt, I was kind of starting to hit a wall on that research, because a lot of times, history is written by the victors and a lot of times it's right. Cleaned up, and there was a lot of other political factors going on around this time. And then I found the poets, and there I found a web book, a really old book that somebody had put online, and it's called Poetry of the Clearances. And it turns out that so at the time Gaelic was illegal, and but poets were still writing their poetry in Gaelic. It just couldn't be translated, and so they were preserved. These accounts and the feeling was preserved until more recently, where they've been translated. And that's amazing. And so getting to read this again, I kept going through, is this a story I can tell? I'm one of these displaced people, or removed people, but like I'm going to create this childlike mist sprite who's going to tell this story. Is this like the right way to tell this? Is this how they would want their stories? There's just a lot that I think as an author you need to be really responsible in how you approach some of this stuff. Yeah. And so I read these poems and they talk about the mist and how she wandered about the mountains crying for her children. And I remember reading that in a coffee shop with like research all around me, just sobbing, being like, okay, this is the story when I was out there and I felt like there's a story here that's asking to be told. I was. And this mist is going, I'm still crying about the heights. I'm still doing all the things that they wrote in this poem 150 years ago. And can you write it down? So
you kind of have a legacy. You're kind of writing in the same vein as those people. Yeah. One of the things that I loved in the parts of this book that I've read, just as your friend, was while there's a lot of substance, I also felt some playfulness from you. And that was so good for me to see that was it that way in reality? Did you really feel like you could play some as you were writing, or was it heavy? What was that like?
Oh, it was heavy. There's heavy content, obviously. And I was so stuck on using this narrator that I developed, who is snarky and potentially unreliable and is a little bit playing devil's advocate with the reader. And and I was really like, I'd already fallen in love with them. The narrator's a he in my mind. I don't know why. And so I was just like, I need to keep using him to tell this story. I think the lightness and the childlikeness and the snarkiness really helps because a story with these difficult roots, even though it's not all on page, I think would be a lot to navigate. But then you kind of get this person like wrapping their arm around their shoulder and being like, hey, I got to tell you the story. Okay, here, I'm going to make a joke about this. And it's maybe going to be a little bit offbeat, but here's something else. And it carries you into it in a really fun way. And so I think in a lot of ways that narrator helped keep me floating, like keep me from getting too weighed down and heavy, and was really fun. There are a couple parts that some of my favorite scenes I could only write after I'd had like a glass of wine. This narrator is just like, you couldn't, if I was too serious and going, okay, I couldn't get the right lightness and wit and stuff. And so there was a lot that forced me to play to kind of create these banter and connections and curiosity that it kept me really grounded in that we are people of many things. We hold multitudes and and there is grief and there is humor and there is hope and there's pain and there's all of these things. And so I think having the narrator helped me learn how to balance both of those while writing it. So I had a lot of fun writing it, which is weird for a story that's so hard, but I think it has to be. So I can kind of like hold the reader's hand and say, like, it's gonna be okay, and we're gonna have a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah. So aside from the occasional glass of wine, what what helped you create this narrative voice?
Oh, okay. It's I get really nerdy about this, so I apologize. I when I started writing this book, obviously Margie is our main character. And then in Act 2, we meet one of the like human children who also becomes a character. And that was essential to say, like, hey, this story is going to be told from the perspective of the land and its children. And I thought, like, but I'm not actually only working with two characters here. The narrator is a character, and he goes through his own character arc. The way that he interacts with Margie and the way he tells this story changes as he goes through the story, as he walks us through the story. But the reader is also a character. And because some of this is written in second person, and the narrator talks directly to the reader, there's this piece of, I was just kind of imagining like the narrator and reader are sitting together and they're watching the Margie and the child play out in the glen, and the narrator's like, yeah, so this is happening. And the reader's like, no, it's not, and there's this like almost internal banter between what the reader feels and what the narrator's telling them to feel. And that was really fun. Really challenging. I kept saying, like, why am I doing this? Why did I decide to tell a novella, which already has to be really pared down, and utilize this really weird narrative structure to do so? But I think, again, there's this bit of like, it starts off with the narrator being pretty like, yeah, okay, like we're going to be a little bit, I'm going to walk you into the story and say, like, okay, well, if Margie could be, could think, she'd think this, but she can't. And it kind of makes the reader go, but she can. But we're seeing this, and it makes the reader a little bit like defend her and brings them alongside, and you kind of get into this like bantering friend group feeling of like narrators kind of picking on them, you're defending them and picking back, and then you see it, and then it grows and changes like a friend group would. So how it was I don't know what helped me create that more than the glass of wine. Lots of talking really nerdily about it to people and watching their eyes glaze over, like, your narrator and the reader can't also be characters. What are you talking about? But like, going into, okay, how do, in this scene, even though I'm writing specifically this one thing that's happening, and here's where Margie is. Here's where this child is. Um, okay, where's the narrator sitting? Where's the reader sitting when we're walking into this glen, into this scene? Like, how are we? Yeah, how is the narrator walking us through? What is he feeling in this situation? How is he, is he noticing we get sad and he's kind of telling a joke to try to lighten it up, or is he going, this is a part where I need to hold your hand because it's going to be hard? And yeah,
I like it. It sounds, I mean, this sounds more like longing-based storytelling instead of superimposed plot, like listening to
mhm.
what they're feeling as the story progresses. And
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Going like the history itself lends this plot structure that I follow, and I create a lot, kind of in that composition idea. I create a lot of math that gives the bones to the book of, okay, each chapter is gonna loosely over for the in Act One loosely oversee 100 years of history,
right.
and then we're gonna slow down and we're gonna go down into one person's life, and then we're gonna etc. So there's this structural math and plot that's driven by history and true events. And then the idea is, well, what if we reimagined that through the perspective of the land and its children? And now you just have to kind of drop, as the writer, drop yourself down into that. Get really, get your roots really deep and be like, what would the tree feel like to grow in the soil that experienced this? And letting them guide it. And there were a couple times where um, I wanted to tell the story like XYZ. And the narrator would kind of be like, I think we need to tell it this way. And interrupt or shift or tweak things. And that was really rewarding to kind of build characters that are strong enough that they can stand up and turn around and go like, you rooted me in the ground enough that I can tell you this is actually how we would have done it.
That takes a lot of humility on the part of the author, a lot of listening, that I love that. So tell us, have you told us, you've been talking a little bit about the characters and the narrator. Is there anything else you want to share about them, or do you feel like you've covered what you want to share on that?
Yeah, I think we covered a good bit of it. I think that's one thing I'd just love for readers to keep in mind is that uh, when the narrator isn't me, I like it's one of those things. It's such a weird thing to be very like strict on. Is that like no, this narrator is also a character, and I didn't write him. So he has his own feelings, and uh, but I think like letting yourself as a reader be a character too, and and feel welcomed into the story. Margie wants you there. Narrator would like to banter with you a little bit. So yeah, I think that's mainly the invitation there.
So you mentioned that you wrote some in second person. What was that like? What were some of the challenges of writing in second person?
Oh, second person is scary because you're presuming a little bit about the
Yeah.
reader. You're presuming what the reader might be feeling or thinking. And that's tricky. And I think I had to create a reader like in my head a little bit. And so if you're reading it and you're like, that's not what I was thinking, actually, like that's okay. That you have to kind of create. Here's probably the person who's walking into this book. And also in a way, like I'm also the reader. So there's like maybe I'm not the narrator, but I'm a little bit the reader. And this is what the narrator's kind of saying to me as I'm reading through it. Here's kind of what I would be wondering if I wasn't writing it. Here's what I'd wonder. And so you kind of have to split yourself a little bit and remove yourself from being the one authoring the whole thing to being somebody experiencing it and going, yeah, this would confuse me. Yeah, I would be wanting to ask the narrator a question here. Or yeah, if I was watching this scene, there would be a tear rolling down my cheek, and the narrator would notice it and want to say something. And so it was constantly this, a camera lens, like when it's zooming in and out, and it contracting into itself. That was this feeling constantly. It was this telescoping in and out of the story and going like, yeah, at the end of the day, I'm overseeing this massive scale thing that somehow also walks very small details. And also I'm just a human being told a story about humanity, and how would that make me feel? Um, and so there's a lot of like needing to kind of come break, you're breaking that fourth wall a lot. And sometimes when you're writing it, you realize like by breaking that fourth wall, there's just some humor, and you're just looking at yourself and saying like, what would I want to hear if I
Yeah,
was reading this? And it's really sometimes really intimate.
that's neat. I like too that you have a character, then you have a narrator who's speaking to a reader who is also sort of a character because of the way this is set up. And so it's sort of multiple layers of narrative in that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And the
that's
reader and the narrator are both adults. So there's a couple, times when, children are at play and they say something or do something, and the two adults look over at each other and have that little like knowing glance of like, you get that? Okay, I got that. Yeah, we both picked up on that. And that happens throughout the book in a lot of different places where the narrator kind of like looks at you and is like, hey, just a reminder, like you are, wherever you're sitting and reading this, you're an adult who can read through the lines. You know
yeah,
what happened. They don't get it. You do.
yeah,
And I think that was really important for a story to, in a way, to ground a story that is told by, like, from the perspective of technically unreliable narrators. This child doesn't understand what all is happening. The land doesn't understand what all is happening. Um, but as adults, like we know, we can read between lines. Like we know, so somewhat of historical themes. At least you can kind of pick up on those things, whether you know the history or not. But you also know heartbreak. You know that when two parents share a look and stuff, you know what that might mean. And the child doesn't and get it yet. And so I think it was really